On a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, Harlan Dykstra stood in the middle of his machine shed in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched his entire spring planting season walk out the door on a flatbed truck. Not literally. The ground was still frozen. The corn wasn't in yet. But when the last of his 3 John Deere 444Os rolled out of the shed and onto the county road, headed for the dealership 40 miles south, Harlan knew what he was looking at. He was looking at a problem that didn't have an obvious solution. And in the farming business, problems without obvious solutions have a way of becoming catastrophes by the time the frost breaks. Let me tell you what had happened, because it matters. All 3 of his tractors had thrown head gaskets within 6 weeks of each other. Not 1, not 2, 3. The 444O was a 130-horsepower machine, a workhorse of the late 1970s and early 1980s, and Harlan had built his entire operation around 3 of them running in rotation. He'd bought the first one in 1979, the second in 1981, and the third in 1983. Same model, different serial numbers, same fundamental weakness. The 6.6-liter 6-cylinder engine in the 444O had a known issue with the head gaskets when the machines were pushed hard in cold weather without proper warm-up time. Harlan knew this. He'd been careful. He'd let them warm up every morning that winter, every single morning, standing in the cold with his coffee watching the temperature gauges climb before he put them under load. And they blew anyway. All 3 of them, one after another, like dominoes falling in slow motion across 6 weeks of February and March. The repair bill from the dealership, Sievert Implement, 40 miles south on Highway 65, was going to be somewhere between $4,200 and $5,100 per tractor, depending on whether the heads could be resurfaced or needed full replacement. That was $12,600 to $15,300 for all 3, and Harlan had $8,400 in his operating account. He'd already borrowed against the next harvest to buy seed corn. The numbers did not work. Let me tell you about Harlan Dykstra, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did next. Harlan was 58 years old in 1987. He'd farmed the same 640 acres in Hardin County his entire adult life, the same ground his father had broken in 1931 and his grandfather had homesteaded before that. The farm had survived the Depression, survived 2 world wars, survived the farm crisis of the early 1980s that had broken 1/3 of his neighbors and sent their land to auction. It had survived all of that because the Dykstra family had a particular relationship with machinery that most farmers didn't. They didn't just operate equipment. They understood it. Harlan's father had taught him that a machine is only as mysterious as your willingness to take it apart. And Harlan had taken a lot of things apart over the years. He could rebuild a carburetor by feel in the dark. He could diagnose a hydraulic leak by the sound it made. He'd overhauled 2 complete diesel engines in his own shop with nothing but hand tools, a factory service manual, and the kind of patience that most people mistake for stubbornness. He was a quiet man. Not unfriendly, but economical with words in the way that men who spend most of their time alone with machinery tend to be. He didn't complain about the tractor situation to his neighbors. He didn't call around looking for sympathy. He drove down to Sievert Implement, talked to the service manager, got the numbers, drove home, and sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours with a legal pad and a pencil doing arithmetic. When he was done with the arithmetic, he called the dealership back and told them he'd be picking up his tractors. Not repaired, just picking them up. The service manager, A man named Doug Crowley, who had been at Sievert Implement for 11 years and who believed with genuine conviction that he had seen every variety of farmer stubbornness the state of Iowa had to offer, told Harlan that was his right, but that he was making a mistake. Harlan thanked him and hung up. He drove down the next morning with his flatbed and loaded all 3 tractors himself, brought them home, rolled them into his machine shed. And then he did something that Doug Crowley, had he known about it, would have found either deeply eccentric or quietly brilliant, depending on his mood. Harlan pulled the cylinder heads off all 3 engines himself, right there in his own shop, cleaned them up, wrapped them in burlap, and put them on a shelf in the back of his barn. Not the machine shed. The barn. The old one, built in 1924, that he used mostly for storage now. He put the 3 tractors back together without their heads, essentially 3 very large, very expensive paperweights, and he parked them in a row along the east wall of the machine shed. Then he went and borrowed a neighbor's older 4020 for the spring planting, paid the neighbor in labor instead of cash, and got his corn in 2 weeks late, but got it in. He had a plan. It just required patience. Let me tell you about the plan, because it's the part of this story that most people who knew Harlan in 1987 didn't understand until much later. Harlan had done his research before he pulled those heads. He'd gotten on the phone with 3 different machine shops, 2 of them in Iowa and 1 in Minnesota, and he'd asked a very specific question. What are the options for the 4440 head gasket problem beyond paying Sievert Implement's labor rate? What he learned was that the problem wasn't the heads themselves. The heads on the 4440 were cast iron and nearly indestructible. The problem was the gasket material, and, in some cases, minor warping of the head surface from the thermal stress of repeated cold starts. A machine shop could resurface the heads for about $180 per head, $360 per engine, $1,080 for all 3. The gaskets themselves were $47 each at that time. The head bolts should be replaced whenever a head was pulled, $23 a set. Total parts and machine shop cost for all 3 tractors, roughly $1,500. Labor, if Harlan did it himself, was 0. The problem was time. Harlan didn't have time during planting season to do 3 complete head jobs. He barely had time to keep up with the work he was already doing. So he made a decision that turned out to be either the most patient or the most reckless thing he'd ever done, depending on how you looked at it. He decided to wait. He'd do 1 tractor at a time in the off-season when he had the hours to do it right. The heads were already off. The machine shop work was already scheduled. He'd have the first tractor running by fall, the second by the following spring, the third by the fall after that. 3 years to get all 3 back, but he'd own them free and clear when he was done, with no debt to the dealership and no interest payments eating his margin. He ran his numbers again on the legal pad. Even with the cost of borrowing the neighbor's 402 for 2 seasons, he came out ahead by just over $11,000 compared to paying Sievert Implement's repair bill. Harlan was not a man who made decisions quickly, but once he made them, he didn't revisit them. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever watched a plan that looks completely reasonable from the inside become something that looks, from the outside, like a man who has simply given up? Because that's what the next 18 months looked like to everyone who drove past Harlan's machine shed and saw those 3 green tractors sitting idle against the east wall. The county road ran right along his property line. People saw them every day, and people in Hardin County, Iowa, in 1987 and 1988, were not in a mood to assume the best about a neighbor's financial situation. The farm crisis had done that to people. When you'd watched a dozen of your neighbors lose their land in the last 5 years, a man with 3 broken tractors sitting in his shed started to look like the beginning of a familiar story. Doug Crowley heard about it. Of course, he heard about it. In a county of 12,000 people with one implement dealership, information moved the way water moves. It found every low place. Crowley mentioned it to a few people. Not unkindly, he would have said, just as a matter of concern. Harlan Dykstra had 3 blown 444Os sitting in his shed and had refused the repair estimate. Probably couldn't afford it. Probably in trouble. Somebody ought to check on him. Harlan heard about what Crowley was saying. He always did. He went to the same church as 2 of Crowley's best customers. He didn't say anything about it. He just kept working. The first tractor came back to life in October of 1987. Harlan had spent 3 weekends on it, working methodically through the John Deere service manual with the pages he needed flagged with strips of masking tape. He'd torqued every head bolt to spec in sequence twice, because the manual said once was sufficient, and Harlan had learned a long time ago that sufficient and right are not always the same thing. He started it on a cold Tuesday morning and let it run for 2 hours before he touched the throttle. It ran like it had just come off the assembly line. Maybe better, because the resurfaced head had a better seal than the original gasket had ever achieved. He used it all fall. Didn't tell anyone, just used it. The second came back in April of 1988. The third in November of 1988. By the time the third tractor was running, Harlan had spent $1,612 total on parts, machine shop work, and the replacement head bolts he'd ordered from a supplier in Waterloo. He had all 3 tractors running, all 3 owned outright, and he had not paid Doug Crowley's dealership a single dollar. He put the burlap-wrapped cylinder heads back on the shelf in the barn. He didn't need them anymore. The engines had new gaskets, resurfaced heads, fresh bolts. The old heads were just cores now, worth maybe $40 apiece as scrap, but Harlan didn't throw them away. He wasn't sure why exactly. They just stayed on the shelf. Let me tell you about what happened next, because the story doesn't end with 3 running tractors. The years went by. Harlan kept farming. His 3 444s kept running. He maintained them with a thoroughness that bordered on the ceremonial. Oil changes on schedule. Coolant flushes every 2 years. Injectors cleaned. Valve lash checked every spring before planting. A machine that is maintained properly will outlast any reasonable expectation of its service life. And Harlan's 3 tractors were proving that point year by year. By 1995, they had more hours on them than most dealers would have recommended for continued service. Harlan didn't care what dealers recommended. He cared what the machines themselves told him, and what they told him was that they were fine. He did have one problem, though, and it was a slow-building one. The 444O had been out of production since 1982. John Deere had moved on to the 4450, and then the 4455, and the parts supply for the 444O had been thinning out for years. Not catastrophically. There were still suppliers, still rebuild kits, still a reasonable aftermarket. But Harlan had learned something from the head gasket situation in 1987 that he never forgot. The time to get the parts you need is before you need them, not after. And so, quietly, over the years, he'd been buying spares. Not hoarding, exactly, just thinking ahead. A set of injectors here, a water pump there, a rebuilt hydraulic pump when he found one at a fair price. He kept it all organized on shelves in the machine shed, labeled in his handwriting on pieces of masking tape. The cylinder heads stayed in the barn. Now, let me tell you about Sievert Implement, because what happened to them is part of this story whether Harlan wanted it to be or not. Sievert Implement had been in business in Hardin County since 1961. Dale Sievert had started it. His son, Brad, had taken over in 1979, and by the late 1980s it was doing well enough. New equipment sales, service contracts, parts counter that stayed busy through the season. Brad Sievert was good at the business side of things. He understood margins and inventory turns and customer relationships. What he was less good at, as it turned out, was reading the long-term direction of the agricultural equipment market and what consolidation in the John Deere dealer network was going to mean for a mid-sized independent operation in a county of 12,000 people. Doug Crowley left in 1993 to go work for a larger dealership in Ames. Brad Sievert hired 2 service managers after him, neither of whom lasted more than 3 years. The parts counter got thinner. The service bays stayed busy, but the margins on service work kept getting squeezed. New equipment sales were the lifeblood of a dealership like Sievert's, and by the late 1990s, farmers in Hardin County who were buying new iron were increasingly driving the extra distance to the larger consolidated dealer in Iowa Falls, where the inventory was bigger and the financing terms were better. Sievert Implement closed in the spring of 2005. Not dramatically. No bankruptcy filing, no auction of the premises, just a notice in the Eldora newspaper that the dealership would be closing at the end of April, and that customers with outstanding service orders should contact the Iowa Falls location. Brad Sievert was 61 years old. He'd been thinking about retirement anyway. The timing just got made for him. Harlan read the notice in the paper. He was 76 years old. He read it twice, set the paper down, and went out to the machine shed to check the oil on his 444 O's. He didn't say anything about it to anyone. But let me tell you what happened about 3 weeks after Sievert Implement closed, because this is the part of the story that people in Hardin County still talk about. Brad Sievert had a problem. When a dealership closes, the parts inventory gets liquidated. Some of it goes back to the manufacturer. Some of it gets sold to other dealers. Some of it gets auctioned. But there's always a category of parts that doesn't fit neatly into any of those channels. Old stock. Obsolete parts for machines that haven't been in production for 20 years. Parts that the manufacturer won't buy back because they've been superseded. Parts that other dealers don't want because there's no market for them. In Sievert Implement's case, that category included a significant quantity of John Deere 4440 parts that had been accumulating in the back of the parts room since the early 1980s. Head gasket sets, head bolt kits, water pumps, injector rebuild kits, and, this is the part that matters, 7 complete cylinder heads, pulled from 444 engines over the years during warranty work and core exchanges, sitting on a shelf in the back of the parts room, wrapped in plastic, tagged with core credit receipts that were now 20 years old and worth nothing. 7 cylinder heads. Cast iron, 4440 specification, in serviceable condition. Brad Sievert called 3 salvage yards. 2 of them offered him scrap iron price, about $35 apiece. The third didn't want them at all. He called 2 other John Deere dealers. Neither had any use for 4440 cores. He put a notice on a bulletin board at the Hardin County Co-op. Nobody called. He sat on them for 2 weeks, and then someone at the co-op mentioned that Harlan Dykstra still ran 3 4x4s and had been buying spare parts for them for years. Brad Sievert thought about that for a day. Then he drove out to Harlan's farm. Now, let me tell you about that conversation, because I want you to understand what it was and what it wasn't. It wasn't an apology. Brad Sievert was not a man who apologized easily, and he had not personally said anything unkind about Harlan in 1987. That had been Crowley's doing, and Crowley had been gone for 12 years. What Sievert was a practical man with 7-cylinder heads he couldn't sell and a farm neighbor who might have a use for them. He drove out on a Thursday afternoon in May of 2005, parked his truck in Harlan's driveway, and knocked on the machine shed door. Harlan was inside, doing something to the hydraulic lines on the number 2 tractor. He was 76 years old and moving a little slower than he used to, but his hands were steady and his eyes were sharp, and the machine shed was as organized as it had ever been. He looked up when Sievert came in. Sievert told him about the heads, 7 of them, 4440 specification. He said he'd take $50 apiece for them, which was better than scrap price, but not by much, and that he'd throw in the remaining head gasket sets and bolt kits from the parts room at no charge, because he just needed them gone. Harlan wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at Sievert for a long moment, without saying anything. Then he said, "What about the rest of the 4440 parts?" Sievert told him what was left: injector kits, water pumps, a rebuilt hydraulic pump, a set of front wheel bearings, 3 sets of brake discs, a box of miscellaneous seals, and O-rings. Harlan said, "How much for all of it?" They settled on $680 for everything. 7 heads, all the gasket sets, all the hardware, all the remaining 4440 specific parts from Sievert Implement's back room. Harlan wrote a check on the spot. They loaded it into Harlan's truck together, the 2 of them, a 76-year-old farmer and a 61-year-old former dealer, carrying cast-iron heads wrapped in plastic out of a closing dealership's parts room and into the bed of a 1998 Ford pickup. When they were done, Sievert stood by his truck for a moment. He looked at Harlan's machine shed, at the 3 green 444s visible through the open door, still running after all these years. He said, "Doug Crowley told people you were in trouble back in '87, that you couldn't afford the repairs." Harlan said, "I know he did." Sievert said, "Were you?" Harlan thought about it for a second. "I could afford them," he said. "I just didn't think they were worth what he was charging." Sievert nodded slowly. He didn't say anything else about it. He got in his truck and drove away. Harlan carried the 7-cylinder heads into the barn and put them on the shelf next to the 3 he'd had there since 1987. 10 heads total now. He stood there for a moment looking at them. Then he went back to the hydraulic lines on the number 2 tractor. Let me tell you about the next several years, because what happened to those heads and what happened to those tractors is not the end of the story. It's barely the middle. Harlan kept farming. He was 76 in 2005, and most people his age in Hardin County had either retired or were farming significantly reduced acreage. Harlan was farming 480 acres. He'd sold 160 to a neighbor in 2001 when the neighbor's son was getting started and needed ground. And he was doing it with the same 3 4440s he'd been running since the early 1980s. His neighbors had long since moved on to newer iron. The 4440 had been replaced in the John Deere line by machines with twice the horsepower and 10 times the electronics. GPS guidance systems, yield monitors, variable rate application. Harlan's tractors had none of that. They had mechanical injection, cast iron everything, and a simplicity of design that meant Harlan could fix anything that went wrong with them using tools he already owned. He was not opposed to modern equipment on philosophical grounds. He was just opposed to debt, and new equipment meant debt, and his 3 paid-off 4 O's were doing the work, so he kept them. His son, Garrett, had come back to the farm in 1998 after 10 years working in agricultural sales in Des Moines. Garrett was 44 in 2005, and he had his father's mechanical aptitude without quite his father's patience. Garrett had grown up watching Harlan work on those tractors, had helped with the head jobs in the late 1980s as a teenager, and had a complicated relationship with the machines. Fond of them the way you're fond of something that shaped your childhood, but also aware that they were old and that old things eventually stop being economical. He and Harlan had conversations about it, quiet ones, the kind of conversations that farming families have where nobody raises their voice, but the disagreement is real. Garrett thought they should look at a newer tractor, one newer machine, maybe a used 7000 series, something with a cab that had working air conditioning and a radio. Harlan listened to these conversations and then went back to what he was doing. He wasn't dismissive of Garrett's point. He just kept doing his arithmetic, and his arithmetic kept coming out the same way. The 4 O's were paid for. The parts were on the shelf. The knowledge of how to fix them lived in Harlan's hands and increasingly in Garrett's. A new tractor would cost $85,000 to $110,000 for a decent used machine in that era, and it would bring with it a whole new inventory of parts they didn't have, a whole new set of systems neither of them knew as well. The arithmetic didn't favor it. Garrett eventually stopped arguing. Not because he agreed exactly, but because the tractors kept running and the arithmetic kept being right, and there's a point at which you stop arguing with arithmetic. Let me tell you about what happened in the fall of 2008, because that's when the cylinder heads in the barn started to matter in a way that nobody had anticipated. The farm economy in 2008 was complicated. Commodity prices had spiked in the spring. Corn hit $7.65 a bushel in June, a price nobody had seen before. And then the broader financial crisis hit in September and October, and the whole picture changed. Input costs had already risen sharply. Fuel was expensive. Fertilizer was expensive. And for farmers who had leveraged themselves to buy more ground or more equipment during the spring price spike, the fall brought a very uncomfortable reckoning. Harlan's neighbor to the north, a man named Ellis Borgman, who had farmed 900 acres and had bought a new tractor and a new planter in the spring on the assumption that $7 corn was the new normal, was in serious trouble by November. Ellis was 52, a good farmer, not reckless by any standard, but he'd made the bet that a lot of people made that year, and the bet had gone wrong. He was looking at a winter of very difficult conversations with his lender. Ellis's problems were not Harlan's problems, but Ellis's equipment problems became Harlan's concern, because that's how it works in Hardin County. In November of 2008, Ellis's John Deere 781O, a 2001 model, 170 horsepower, the kind of machine Garrett had been suggesting Harlan should look at, threw a head gasket. Not a coincidence exactly. The 781O had a known issue with the 7.6-liter engine under high-hour use, and Ellis's machine had 6,400 hours on it and had not been maintained with Harlan's rigor. The repair estimate from the Iowa Falls dealer was $6,800 for parts and labor, and Ellis didn't have $6,800 in a form he could easily access in November of 2008. Ellis came to Harlan. not for money. He knew better than to ask for money. He came because someone had told him that Harlan had been rebuilding his own heads for 20 years and might know something useful. Harlan listened to Ellis describe the problem. He asked a few questions. Then he said, "Come look at something." He took Ellis to the barn and showed him the shelf. 10 cylinder heads wrapped in plastic or burlap, labeled in Harlan's handwriting. A complete inventory of gasket sets, bolt kits, machine shop contacts in Waterloo and Iowa Falls. 2 decades of accumulated knowledge about exactly this problem on exactly this type of engine. Ellis stared at the shelf for a long time. He said, "Those aren't 7810 heads." "No," Harlan said, "but the principle is the same. And I know a machinist in Waterloo who's done this job on the 7810 before. I can call him." He called the machinist. The machinist came out, pulled the head, found the warping was minor, resurfaced it in his mobile shop. Parts and machine shop labor, $890. Ellis did the reassembly himself with Harlan standing next to him, talking him through the torque sequence from memory. The 7810 was running again in 4 days. Ellis shook Harlan's hand when it was done and said he didn't know how to thank him. Harlan said he didn't need thanks, but that if Ellis ever found himself with 4,440 parts he didn't need, he should remember where to bring them. Word got around. In a county of 12,000 people, word always gets around. Let me tell you about the next few years, because what Harlan had built in that barn, not just the parts but the knowledge, the relationships with machinists, the systematic approach to a problem that most people treated as an expensive emergency, turned out to be something that other farmers needed. He didn't set up a business. He was very clear about that with himself and with anyone who asked. He was not a parts dealer. He was not a repair shop. He was a farmer who happened to have a barn full of 4,440 heads and 20 years of experience pulling and reinstalling them. And if a neighbor had a problem he could help with, he would help with it. He kept a ledger, because Harlan kept a ledger for everything. But the ledger was more about knowing what he had than about making money. He charged cost for parts when he had them and charged nothing for his time. Over the next 5 years, he helped 7 different farmers in and around Hardin County with head gasket jobs on 444Os and related engines. 3 of them were 444Os. 2 were the older 4020, which had a different engine but the same fundamental approach to the repair. 2 were other makes entirely. An International 1086, a Case 2390, where the specific parts were different, but the methodology was the same, and Harlan had the machinist contacts and the patience to work through it. He used 4 of the 10 heads he'd bought from Sievert Implement. The other 6 stayed on the shelf, along with the 3 original heads from his own tractors in 1987. 9 heads total, still in the barn, still wrapped, still labeled. Garrett watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and something that took him a while to identify. It wasn't quite pride, though it was close to that. It was more like the feeling of seeing something you'd been close to your whole life suddenly come into focus. Understanding not just what it was, but why it was. He'd grown up thinking of his father's parts inventory as eccentricity, or maybe stubbornness, the same quality that had kept 3 aging tractors in the shed when newer machines were available. He understood now that it wasn't stubbornness. It was a coherent philosophy about how to maintain the capability to do work over time across circumstances that you couldn't fully predict. You kept the knowledge. You kept the parts. You kept the relationships with people who could do the work you couldn't do yourself. And when the emergency came, and it always came, you were ready. Garrett started keeping his own ledger. Let me tell you about Harlan in his later years, because the man deserves to be described as he was, not just as the figure in the story. He was not a nostalgic person. He didn't talk about the old days as better than the present. He didn't have strong opinions about modern technology in the abstract. He thought GPS guidance was probably useful if you had the ground to justify it, and he thought electronic diagnostics were probably fine if you had someone who understood them. What he had opinions about was the specific, whether a specific piece of equipment was worth what it cost, whether a specific repair was worth what the dealer wanted for it, whether a specific part was going to be available in 10 years when you needed it again. He thought in terms of decades, not seasons, and that was unusual enough in farming that it looked to people who didn't know him well like stubbornness or conservatism or an old man's resistance to change. He was 82 years old in 2011. He'd had a mild heart episode in 2009 that had slowed him down some, and Garrett was doing most of the physical work on the farm by then. But Harlan was still in the machine shed most mornings, still checking the oil, still running his hand along the engine blocks of the 3 4 4 4s. The way a man runs his hand along the neck of a horse he's owned for 30 years. He knew those engines the way he knew his own hands. He knew their sounds and their rhythms and their particular small complaints. He died in January of 2013. He was 83 years old. The funeral was at the Methodist Church in Eldora, and it was full, which surprised Garrett a little, not because his father wasn't respected, but because Harlan had been so quiet about his life that Garrett hadn't fully realized how many people he'd helped over the years. Ellis Borgman was there. 6 other farmers were there whose machines Harlan had helped fix. The machinist from Waterloo drove 2 hours in January to be there. Doug Crowley was not there, but Brad Sievert was, sitting in the 3rd row, and he stayed for the reception afterward and shook Garrett's hand and said that his father had been one of the most capable men he'd ever known, and that he was sorry it had taken him so long to recognize it. Garrett thanked him. He didn't say anything else about it. Let me tell you about what Garrett did in the months after his father died, because this is where the story turns in a direction that Harlan, had he known about it, would have found either amusing or entirely predictable, depending on his mood. Garrett was 49 years old. He'd been running the farm for several years in practical terms, but Harlan's death made it official in a way that felt different. He walked through the machine shed and the barn and the shop, taking inventory the way his father had taught him, methodically with a ledger, noting what was there and what condition it was in. The 3 4 4 4s were there, all running, all maintained. The parts shelf in the machine shed was there, organized and labeled, and the barn shelf was there, with 9-cylinder heads on it, wrapped in burlap and plastic, labeled in Harlan's handwriting. Garrett stood in front of that shelf for a long time. He thought about 1987 when his father had pulled those first 3 heads rather than pay Sievert Implements' repair bill. He'd been a teenager then, old enough to understand what was happening but not old enough to understand why. He thought about 2005, when his father had bought 7 more heads from Brad Sievert for $50 apiece. He thought about Ellis Borgman's 7810 in 2008, and the 6 other farmers his father had helped, and the machinist from Waterloo who had driven 2 hours in January to attend a funeral. 9 heads, 3 from 1987, 6 from 2005. Plus the gasket sets and bolt kits and the rest of the 4 4 parts, still organized, still labeled, still exactly where Harlan had put them. Garrett made a decision. He was going to keep farming the way his father had farmed. He was going to keep the 444 O's running. He was going to maintain the parts inventory and the machinist relationships and the ledger. And he was going to keep the heads in the barn, because you never knew when someone was going to need them. He also made one other decision. He was going to write it down, not for publication, not for any audience, just for himself and eventually for his own kids if they wanted it. He got a new ledger, and he started at the beginning in 1987, and he wrote down everything he could remember about what his father had done and why. He filled 43 pages over the course of that winter. He called the machinist in Waterloo 3 times to fill in details he didn't know. He called Ellis Borgman. He called Brad Sievert. He talked to the farmers his father had helped. What he ended up with was not a business plan or a manual. It was something closer to a philosophy, written in the plain language of a man who had spent his life around machinery. The core of it was simple. The parts you need in an emergency are the parts nobody else thinks are worth keeping. The knowledge you need in an emergency is the knowledge nobody else thinks is worth maintaining. The relationships you need in an emergency are the ones you built before the emergency happened. His father hadn't been hoarding. He'd been preparing. There's a difference, and the difference is that preparation has a purpose. Garrett kept farming. The 444 O's kept running. The heads stayed in the barn. Let me tell you about what happened in 2019, because the story doesn't end with Garrett's ledger. By 2019, the 444O had been out of production for 37 years. The machines that were still running, and there were more of them than you might expect because a well-maintained 444O is nearly indestructible, were now genuinely old iron, and the parts supply had gotten genuinely thin. Not impossible, but thin. The aftermarket suppliers who had been making 444O gasket sets in the 1990s had mostly moved on. The machine shops that had specialized in 444O heads were fewer. The knowledge of how to do the job correctly was increasingly concentrated in the hands of older mechanics who were retiring or had retired. Garrett was 55 in 2019. His daughter, Maren, was 24, and she had come back to the farm 2 years earlier after finishing an agricultural engineering degree at Iowa State. She was smart and practical and had her grandfather's systematic mind, and she had read every page of Garrett's 43-page ledger and asked him questions about it for 2 years. She understood the 444O the way Harlan had understood it, not just as a machine to operate, but as a system to maintain over time. In the spring of 2019, a farmer named Vernon Rasmussen in the next county over, he'd heard about Garrett through the machinist in Waterloo, who was still in business, still doing head jobs, and who had become something of a clearinghouse for 444O information in central Iowa, called Garrett with a Problem. Vernon had a 444, that had thrown a head. He'd called 3 shops. None of them had a head in stock. The aftermarket gasket sets were back-ordered 6 weeks. He was looking at missing spring planting or paying a dealer to do a full engine rebuild at a cost that made Sievert Implement's 1987 estimate look modest. Garrett told him to come over. He took Vernon to the barn. The shelf was still there. The heads were still there. 9 of them, wrapped and labeled, 32 years of patience sitting on a shelf in a 1924 barn in Hardin County, Iowa. Garrett sold Vernon a head and a complete gasket set and the matching bolt kit. He charged him cost, which was what his father had always charged. He called the machinist in Waterloo to confirm the resurfacing specs and walked Vernon through the torque sequence from memory. The same sequence Harlan had walked him through in 1987 when Garrett was a teenager handing his father wrenches. Vernon Rasmussen had his tractor running in 3 days. He called Garrett afterward and asked how he could possibly have had those parts sitting there after all this time. Garrett thought about how to answer that for a moment. Then he said, "My father pulled those heads in 1987 and put them on a shelf because he thought he might need them someday." He was right, just not in the way he expected. He needed them for other people. Vernon didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "How many do you have left?" Garrett said, 8. 8 heads. 32 years after Harlan Dykstra had pulled the first 3 off his blown 444Os rather than pay a dealership's repair bill. 32 years of storage in a 1924 barn, wrapped in burlap and plastic, labeled in a dead man's handwriting. The dealership that had originally refused to work with Harlan on the price had been closed for 14 years. The service manager who had told people Harlan was in trouble had been gone for 26 years. The parts that Sievert Implement couldn't sell for scrap price were now, in 2019, genuinely irreplaceable. Not because Harlan had been a prophet, but because he had been patient, and because he had understood something about time and machines, and the way useful things get discarded before their usefulness is finished. Let me tell you one last thing, because the story deserves an ending that's true to the man it's about. Maren Dykstra is 29 years old now. She runs the farm with her father. She has her great-grandfather's methodical hands and her grandfather's philosophical patience and her father's ability to write things down. The 3-4-4-4 O's are still running. 40-plus years on the original blocks, maintained to a standard that the engineers who designed them in the 1970s would have found either gratifying or astonishing. The barn shelf still has heads on it. The ledger Garrett started in 2013 is on its 3rd volume. Last spring, Maren came to Garrett with a proposal. She'd been reading about the part supply situation for the 444O's successor machines, the 4450, the 4455, the early 496O, machines that were now 30 to 35 years old themselves, with the same trajectory of thinning part supply and fading institutional knowledge that the 444O had followed. She had a list of the critical failure points, the parts that would be hard to find in 10 years, the machine shops that still had the tooling to do the work. She had a spreadsheet. She had a plan. Garrett read through it. He thought about his father standing in front of that barn shelf in 1987, wrapping 3 cast-iron heads in burlap because he thought he might need them someday. He thought about 2005, when Brad Sievert had driven out to the farm with 7 more heads that nobody else would buy. He thought about Ellis Borgman in 2008 and Vernon Rasmussen in 2019, and the machinist from Waterloo who had driven 2 hours in January to attend a funeral for a man he'd never met socially, but had worked alongside for 20 years. He looked at Maren's spreadsheet for a long time. Then he said yes. The parts are already coming in. They're going on a shelf in the barn next to the heads that have been there since 1987, labeled in Maren's handwriting this time, which looks nothing like Harlan's but serves exactly the same purpose. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for people to remember why they were built. And some families don't just farm the land. They farm the knowledge too. Putting it up in the fall, keeping it through the winter, bringing it out again in the spring when somebody needs it and nobody else has it left. The dealer folded. The service manager moved on. The parts room got liquidated for less than scrap. and the heads are still in the barn.